So I believe this is our fifth Pride Talk of the year, and we are excited to host Jacqueline Williams-Hines. Jacqueline's going to be speaking to us about the power of difference. I've had an opportunity to have several conversations with Jacqueline over the last probably year or so, getting to know her and hearing her story. So I think you'll find her story, her background, extremely interesting and hopefully thought-provoking. And I understand that there is an opportunity after the dialogue to ask questions. So sit back, enjoy, and we're going to pass it over to you, Jacqueline. Thank you so much.
So one thing I have to say about autism, it has made me extremely resilient, if not tenacious. So I had the misfortune of having my computer crash this morning. So I not only no longer have my presentation, my prepared presentation, I had to kind of revamp my notes. So I hope you will forgive me for the top of my head for kind of referring to this, but I'm hoping to kind of get through this and then we can have a more open dialogue. So with that being said, good afternoon and welcome to the Springfield College Pride Talk Speaker Series. I'm Jacqueline Williams-Hines, autism specialist, community change agent, advocate, author, public speaker, radio personality, adjunct professor, Eunice Shriver Institute Lynn Fellow, new host of Focus Today, which will be a talk show on Focus Springfield. But most importantly, the most distinguished title I hold is mother. And more important than that, I am the African-American mother of an African-American son diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Today I want to discuss the power of difference. Often we hear the term power and positive connotations are elicited. Our expectation is that this is an advantageous property in a set of circumstances. However, when the word is used in the context of inertia, or conversely, momentum, its outcome can take on damaging overtones. As a Lynn Fellow, my focus of study, much like that of my co-fellows, was the impact of cultural influences as contributing factors in diagnostic disparities. Autism being a developmental diagnosis that impacts approximately 2% of the world's population, and whose hallmark features are delays or deficits in language, communication, social skill acquisition, cognitive development, and narrow fields of interest, was not being diagnosed across multicultural populations at the same rates. In the U.S., while African Americans have begun to make gains, we continue to experience a near 18-month diagnostic disparity to our white counterparts. When looking at other cultural factors such as language barriers for ESL or English as second language populations or immigrant populations, this disparity was clearly a part of contributing to this factor. In African American populations, however, cultural inhibitors stemming from racism and other systemic biases were found to be more a correlative factor. Before we continue, let's define racism. Racism is a systemic construct of an imbalance of power by virtue of color, cultural heritage, or racial class by which the power majority benefits by no effort of their own from the construct. We all have the ability to be biased or prejudiced. We all do not share the ability to be racist. Now, many of you may ask, how does this connect to diagnostic disparities? This, for me, initially appeared to be a relatively clear-cut correlation, if not supportive argument for a causative factor in disparities. As an advocate interested in narrowing the disparities gap, I did not anticipate the disproportionate diagnosis of ADHD, oppositional defiance disorders, or conduct disorders in this population that would go on to feed the school-to-prison pipeline. I believe that all I had to do as a Massachusetts Act Early ambassador was share this information with my community, and disparities would narrow due to earlier and more accurate diagnoses. And miraculously, I would usher in a generation onto academic success and positive outcomes. So when I emerged from that cloud of disillusion and began to peel back the layers of complexity of this task, I was confronted by the very large and sobering elephant in the room. That the power of difference can build a network of supports for this population once they're acknowledged and respected, or could remain the boulder in the stream, diverting and in some case subverting service delivery. What I did not anticipate was the extent to which all stakeholders would be contributors to this dilemma. Historically, from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin, the onus of keeping our children safe rested on the shoulders of parents of color. From whistling at a white woman to wearing a hoodie, parental practices come into question when considering what is socially acceptable behavior for African Americans. From stepping out of the path of a white person to receiving the talk upon obtaining your license, African Americans have a preconditioned history that says to control your behavior is not only a strategy for safety, but survival. The anxiety of constant scrutiny permeates every aspect of your life outside the confines of your home. Now let's consider the markers of autism: deficits in language and communication, social skill acquisition deficits, cognitive delays, and narrow fields of interest or perseveration. Sounds a lot like substance abuse, doesn't it? What if every institution you encounter as an African American with autism was not familiar with your cultural norms and atypical presentations? Would this not present a threat outside the protective walls of your home? National statistics are 1 in 59 among 8-year-olds in the US. Boys are diagnosed 1 in 38. Now factor in the prevalence of delayed identification and accurate diagnosis in African American males. Add to this the disproportionate diagnosis of ADHD, oppositional defiance, and conduct disorders in urban school systems who rely heavily on punitive remediation as behavioral deterrents. You will see, and we will continue to see, a population of African American males entering the legal system via the school-to-prison pipeline. This results in an underserved population sorely in need of therapeutic intervention, already marginalized by systems of delivery and unequipped to support, much less protect themselves. Another generation lost. As educators, future therapists, and service providers, it is incumbent upon us to acknowledge and understand the cultural significance and the historic foundations so that we can become the power of difference. Thank you. Again, as I said, if autism has not taught me anything, it has taught me resilience and perseverance. So I just kind of wanted to lay that background, and now I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my son's journey. My son Joshua presented typically until he was about 2 years old. And then an aunt came to me and said, he's not communicating age appropriately. And I'm thinking, well, what are you talking about? He talks, he plays, he interacts with the family. And then I started to really pay attention to our interactions. And I see a lot of times there's so much unspoken language that goes on within the home, within the family dynamic. It is our cultural norm inside of our home. I realized that Joshua was losing words. All the games of hide and seek and peekaboo and mommy, I love you were slowly starting to disappear. Joshua regressed back to being nonverbal. And with that lack of communication, there became a level of anxiety and outward presentations that were not socially acceptable. Tantrums, meltdowns, attacking me for no apparent reason. As a mother of color, the cornerstone of our ability to parent is discipline. Making our children behave socially acceptable while in the community. I had none. I could not tell you when Josh was going to elope and dart into traffic. I couldn't tell you when he was going to attack me for no apparent reason and bite, or have a meltdown that would last for hours. And as a parent of color, I lived under the real specter of the crack baby syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome. So there was, even though I knew that I hadn't partaken in any of these vices during his gestation, there was so much guilt attached to his behavior because I could not control it as his mother. And I also knew that that put us under a specter of, what are you doing wrong? This had to be your fault. Look at where you live. Look at how you live. So, what did I do? Well, I still had to work. I had a 10-year-old son who was entering middle school and slowly entering puberty, and I had a husband, not to mention a mother and a father with health issues living next door. I had a pretty typical life, as typical goes. But I went back to school and I attained my bachelor's degree. And this was much later because actually my older son and I graduated undergrad and graduate school together. But I got a 3.98. But it was all this journey about, I need to know what this is. How do I fix this? How do I make him normal again? Well, those are the problems you encounter when they're 2, when they're 3, when they're 5, and when they're still cute. I didn't anticipate the problems that would come when he became 6'2", when he became someone that people in the community may look at as a threat. I recall being in a store one time, and we were at the mall, at the dollar store, getting snacks that we were going to sneak into the movies because I'm on a budget. And I remember Joshua and the most beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed little girl playing hide and seek at the ends of the aisles, and he's peeking and she's peeking and they're both giggling, and it was so innocent. And then I looked over his shoulder and I saw his father's face, and alarms went off. And I had to explain to probably one of the most gentle young men that I've ever known that that's inappropriate, that could put your life in danger, just for the fact that you're 6'2" and you're a black man and you're a stranger. How do you convey those type of societal dangers to someone impaired with social skill deficits and language barriers? And how do we keep you safe? I've done a lot of work around educating on autism. One of the first things that I started working on, and I'm proud to say I'm self-published, and my dream is one day to see my books in school systems. I have a children's book series, this being the 4th. And of course, the protagonist is my son, Joshua. And the 4th book, Joshua Over Here, actually looks at the phenomenon that children with autism have with meeting or sustaining eye contact. Why is that really important? Because that's part of communication. And culturally, not making eye contact means different things to different people. For African Americans, sometimes we don't really think about looking someone directly in the eye because historically we've known that can be perceived as being threatening or dangerous to us. Our white counterparts will tell you it may look as if you're being dishonest. How many times do we tell children, when you look at someone, look them in the face, shake their hand, make sure you're making that contact? What happens if you have a diagnosis that impedes that? This book was actually written in conjunction with my older son, Robert. Robert had a lot of anxiety because he wanted to be this big brother. He he was that kid that kept coming to me and my husband saying, when am I going to get a big brother? And I kept trying to bribe him with a puppy, and it didn't work. So 8 years later, we had to have another child. But when you have a child with autism who can't read those social cues, what happens with their peers or with their siblings? Robert had a lot of anxiety, and that manifested itself in him withdrawing. So again, he was impacted by the diagnosis of autism. But because his teachers weren't aware of that, this was part of his culture. He was sullen. He was thuggish. He was, and Robert's probably, again, one of the most quiet kids you'll know. Now his hands are big as, baseball mitts. But he is one of the most mild-mannered people I know. He is now a social worker. I thought that being an ambassador for Mass Act Early and being able to bring information such as the milestones and Know the Signs Act Early initiative to our community was going to solve all the problems. I said, listen, it gives you all your milestones and your delays from birth to 5. All you gotta do is follow this, bring it to your pediatrician. I didn't think about a population that may not have a primary care physician or have a relationship with a primary care physician. So how do you communicate those deficits or those fears to someone that you may see 15 minutes this month, and then next time you come in, you'll see, an assistant or a nurse practitioner? We don't even get to build those relationships because of socioeconomic deficits facing these communities. How do we bridge that gap of what is a diagnosis and a cultural divide? As educators and social service providers, we have no other choice. Unless we're going to see this large population fall through the cracks and continue to fall through the cracks, we have to bridge that divide. We have to acknowledge cultural differences, and we have to acknowledge our own biases. I say time and time again, racism is a social construct. It is not a condemnation, because I have a lot of people say, but I'm not racist. I never said you were racist. I said, however, you benefit from the construct by no fault of your own. Unless we start to acknowledge the elephant in the room, we're never going to make progress. Questions? Comments? I know, come on, somebody say something, because now I'm getting uncomfortable.
Jacqueline, you talked about the power of difference. So you talked a lot about your son and some of the societal perceived differences or deficits that he brings to the table. What have been some of the positive aspects that you've seen in terms of your son's, engagement?
Yeah, I think he is, did I just start glowing? Because I do that when I talk about him. So I think one of the most positive things that I've seen come out of Joshua's autism is that he truly does not see bias. He thinks everyone is good and everyone's wonderful and everyone wants to be his friend. Now, that can be very dangerous because he's not able to read those really subtle social cues. But he has that open mind and that receptiveness that I want to get to know you. So for him, it's almost like saying, well, you have green eyes. It's just part of you, and it doesn't really color his perception of who the person is. It's just a difference. I admit that I am pretty much a helicopter mom, and I'm trying to be a helicopter mom in retirement because he turns 22 tomorrow, and he's transitioning into adult services. But there are a lot of times when I've seen people who've interacted with him. Okay, I have to give you a little backstory about Joshua. So, does anyone know what the term perseveration means in autism? So it's a term that really denotes really, really narrow fields of interest. Sometimes you may have a child with autism who only wants to talk about dinosaurs or trains. When Joshua was little, His thing was animated movies. And he could watch an animated movie one time, give you all the dialogue verbatim and all the voices. He could draw scenes from the animation as if it was a freeze frame. And initially it was things like, Finding Nemo. I remember one time making his bed on bunk beds and looking and seeing a whole underwater color panorama that he had drawn from Finding Nemo. So I was at my nephew's wedding one time, and I'm getting a drink, and I hear someone say, well, how long has your son been tap dancing? I'm like, son doesn't tap dance. They go, your son is on the floor tap dancing. My son had actually watched Happy Feet, and was able to isolate all of the dance moves from Savion Glover's choreography and was performing. And so from there, it kind of went into all of the step-up movies, the hip-hop movies, and he's a budding hip-hop dancer, choreographer, and here's the connection. So we go to open mics a lot. I like to let him perform. And I've had so many other performers come up to him and like, man, I wish I had it in me to get up and sing. I'm a rapper, I'm a singer, but I'm scared. And he's always like, dude, if you sing, then you're a singer. Don't worry about it. Just do what comes natural. I'm a dancer. And it never occurs to him that people may laugh at him or think that he's not so great. In his mind, he's a dancer, and it's definitive. So I see that in him, that it is so infectious that it's just pretty absolute. If you say that you want to write, okay, well, there you're a writer. And it's so infectious because it just gives people that energy to say, wow, if Joshua feels like that, and if he can do it, I can do it. Now, they may not understand that he doesn't have the social skill acquisition to say, oh, I'm nervous or I'm scared. I'm a dancer, and that's all there is to it. So that has been such a positive to me because I see him reach out to other people, and I would say without doubt, he's probably the one person I can say truly does not see color, does not see sex. If you say I'm a dancer, you're his best friend. And he doesn't care if you're in a wheelchair. He doesn't care that, you're nonverbal. He's gonna try to teach you a dance move. And it's that sense of wonder and tenacity that I try to just, if it's by osmosis, I need a little of that to keep me going. Because that is, I think, especially in today's climate, that keeps me from feeling beat down and defeated. And I see him have that effect on people around him. And I think a lot of parents will say the same. I think that would be probably the most positive. Bless you. Yes.
So I want to thank you for your talk, and I remember Robert being his school counselor.
Yes.
So glad to hear he's entering the social work field.
Yes.
So that was good to hear. What was interesting, you talked about the racial disparities in service delivery and just diagnosis. So that was very interesting, looking at that from multiple levels. But I really like what you talked about, how you talked about racism, and you talked about the elephant in the room, and just now you're talking about the innocence of Robert, how he sees the world.
Joshua.
Joshua, I'm sorry. And what was interesting is just something happened to me recently where I was in the pool and I was in the locker room, and it must have been a 4 or 5-year-old kid. And he was with his dad and the older brother, and they're in the back, and I, wanted to give them privacy, and they were ending, so I didn't want to change in front of them, so I just waited out front. So he saw me, and he just waved at me and said, hello. And I said, hello. And he said, how are you? And I said, I'm doing fine. And he said, what's your name? And I said, Tony. I said, what's your name? And I'm going closer, and he tells me his name, and he spells it with one A. And I said, you don't have 2 A's in your name? And he says, no. And he engages this conversation with me. And it was interesting. His dad was like, come on, let's go, let's go, let's go. But it really spoke to the innocence of society, of young people, similar to Joshua. Really didn't see me as a large African-American male, but he saw me as Tony. He's spelling my name. And I said, wow, that really touched me, and then get my thoughts together. but I wanted to talk to the dad about the innocence of children. So I just want, I value this conversation because, wow, look at where we are as a society. But I really appreciate your talk of not just looking at Joshua from a deficit perspective,
Yes.
but really looking at his strengths and what he can offer and how inspiring he is to others. So just wanted to just put all that together, just share my comments.
It was very difficult trying to have that conversation with him. And when I referenced that, you know, the talk when your child gets 16 and get a license. I remember when Robert turned 16, having that, you know, when you get pulled over, keep your hands on the steering wheel, don't be rude, you know, no quick movements, keep your wallet somewhere that is easily accessible. And it's so ironic that I remember having that talk, and then I just saw an article about families of color, that this is truly a thing, that we actually have this talk when our children start to, you know, navigate the community. But another layer of that came when, you know, I think all parents, we can't wait for the day when our teenagers can start running errands so we can say, go drop your brother off at soccer practice. But I had to have a whole different conversation with Robert, because it was like, when you get pulled over, you know, remain calm. You can't, if Joshua's in the car, we don't want him to get startled. I don't want him to do anything that's perceived as threatening. So, I mean, my car is totally plastered with the autism ribbon, with a decal that says, you know, passenger has autism, may not respond socially appropriately. And you still wonder, will that be enough? So having not only the responsibility of being a big brother, but having the responsibility of being a big brother of a sibling who has autism. So now, not only when you leave the house, you have to worry about your own safety, but your brother's safety, because he may not be able to respond socially appropriate to those social cues. It is very real, and I think that in a perfect world for me, we would get rid of the elephant in the room. I don't think that anyone is more uncomfortable talking about racism than people of color. We don't want to talk about it, we don't want to live it, but it is our reality. But I think that as soon as we say it, it becomes almost this indictment of other people in the room, and that's not the purpose. So that's why I always say, it's a construct. You didn't make it. You may inherently benefit from it, whether you want to or not, but it's not your fault and you did not create it. You're part of it, just like I'm a part of it. So for me, like everything else, it's a part of my reality. Whether I'm talking education, whether I'm talking social services, healthcare, law enforcement, it permeates every aspect of my life. When I go and advocate for services for my son, I have to be really cognitive of how I present. Now, we talk, and it's funny because friends and I talk all the time about code switching. Does everybody know what code switching is? Okay, so you see me here today, and this is typically me. But of course, when I'm at home and I'm with my family, I code switch, and I think we all do. We go back to our cultural norms and our cultural comfort zone. But I think that a lot of times when we're advocating for our children, it's really difficult to code switch. It's very hard for me to be the mom and be present in a lot of these meetings. I don't have that luxury. I have to remain, I almost have to think and talk in third person. I'm his advocate. You know, I'm Ms. Williams-Hines, you cannot be, because I've been in meetings where, oh, the mom is upset and I'm just this entity that you think you're going to ignore. Not gonna happen. Excuse you, I am the team leader here. And I have to pull that rank because I've seen it happen to so many parents where they're not being serviced or is being looked at as a behavioral issue. I was really excited. As I noted, I am an advocate here. But I taught a course entitled The Implications of Disabilities for Families. And I was so excited because I really wanted the students to get a perspective of what it was like to be a family member with a disability. And invariably, we pretty much focused on autism because that's my comfort zone. So we set up these mock families, and I gave them contingencies. And initially, I said, well, you're married and you have an 18-year-old autism. Tell me about your family. And I got such rosy pictures. Oh, I'm gonna have a nanny and I'm making 6 figures and we're gonna do all this stuff. And I said, okay, I like you guys, you're optimistic. I said, okay, so let's throw some contingencies in there. Your child is a cutter because their big brother elopes and you've been referred for 51A 6 times. Your mother cannot work because the child has chronic insomnia and pica and they're eating inedible objects. You spend a lot of time in the emergency room. The father, you're making 6 figures, therefore you're not getting any services. So the majority of your services, your income is going to services for your child. You have a second mortgage for which you are now being foreclosed. The only apartment that you can afford is close to a body of water. Drowning is the #1 cause of families on the autism spectrum. Tell me about your life. And they got doe-eyed. And I said, the reason why I throw these things at you because these are the families that you are going to be servicing. It is not enough to go into a home and think that because I have a degree and because I have this skill set, that I'm going to change a life in 2 hours. I was a behavior therapist. I did a lot more social work than I did behavior therapy. So probably that's why I'm not a BCBA now. But I say that to say we are a nexus for special education. Massachusetts has led the nation in education up until early 80s, I believe, when they changed the legislative wording to reflect the national norms. We have a large population of people with disabilities. Unless we start to look at the individual and look at the cultural aspects of their life and take that into consideration when we're doing service delivery, we are not going to be effective. Families are not going to be able to generalize the skill sets that we teach in those 2 hours, and it's basically just a cycle. They're not going to be successful. Questions, comments? I thank you all so much for your time, and I do apologize. I had some of the coolest visuals. I had my son like dancing and modeling. And I think he's like, he's a bag of, he's all that in a bag of chips. He's so cute. 6'2", and he's like, he has this thing about 80s hip hop. So he has like the high top fade and he's all into the tagging and stuff, and he's just amazing. But I think the biggest thing for me is just his heart. His heart is so pure. He just wants to make people happy with dance and singing, and I want him to be successful.
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you foresee his future like? Like, what are your hopes for him? And
Good question. As I said, he's turning 22 tomorrow, and that is probably one of the most frightening benchmarks for parents because now we're no longer supported under the school department and IDEA. I've always, typically you start to make their life plan around, their transitional plan around 14. And I've always said that his transitional plan was going to be 3-pronged. It was going to be vocational, educational, and social skills. So what I find a lot of time in service delivery is it's almost like you have to cherry pick from these baskets. Either you go to school, or you go into a social day program, or you can do this activity. And that was never an option for me. Right now, my son is a student in the Westfield State University's ICE program because of his love for dance. He says he is a dance major. Right now, his class is the fundamentals of hip hop. And he has a 1-to-1 dance tutor. We're actually looking at him transitioning into Berkshire Hills Music Academy. But my story is not the norm, because I was, this is so funny. I was actually just laid off. So I actually had to go to like FutureWorks and apply and stuff. And then I started talking to them in their YouthWorks program about their disability program. And statistically, there isn't a very high success rate for employment for people with disabilities. I remember when my son was diagnosed, like the best we could hope for or what looked like success was maybe him being a greeter at Walmart and potentially living in a community living. For me, that's never going to happen. I work very hard to make sure that there's a framework in place that he will be successful and as inclusive a setting as possible. So not only are we pursuing academics, I am actively looking to work with FutureWorks, with their developmental department. And I said, if that means, you sending him on a job and I go in and do a task analysis on these job tasks and breaking it down in a way that we can teach him, and then doing work with that entity around autism awareness, then that's what I'm going to do. Now, do I look at it as doing consultation work? No, I look at it as being a mom who knows that one day my mortality, it's inevitable. And I pray that I will outlive my son. But with that comes the fear that will he be independent enough? And will society be able to support him in that independence without the specter of bias or racism? My story is definitely not common. More common than not, what happens is not only are students pushed out before their 22nd birthday, they're pushed out without supports. Joshua was actually unlawfully graduated, and this is how the story goes. So because Joshua's traditionally was diagnosed with PDD-NOS. I'm not sure, is everyone familiar with the transition from the diagnostic parameters in, what was it, 2014, I think, when they changed from the DSM-4 to 5? So prior to the DSM-5, the autism spectrum disorder was comprised of 5 distinctive diagnoses. We had classic autism, PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, Asperger's syndrome, Rett syndrome, and childhood disintegrative disorder. Now, childhood disintegrative disorder and Rett syndrome have a biological component because you're physiologically going through regression, much like MS. So those 2 diagnoses were taken out and kind of put more in a physiological diagnosis. So you had the last 3. Well, the thought process was that because autism presents so differently, vastly different, even under the same diagnosis, from child to child, we would look at it as a spectrum disorder and look at severity. So that's when it changed from the DSM-5 having the 5 criteria until the ASD criteria we now have under the DSM-5. So that kind of allowed, yes, it did allow for more people to be diagnosed, but it also kind of watered down the parameters of the diagnosis. And it actually gave more of a generic presentation to service delivery. Everyone was going to get in their service grid X amount of days of speech therapy, X amount of OT, and not really looking at the deficits, the individual deficits and where their needs were. So for Joshua, he was PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, which I'd like to say is our C students. They're, have delays or deficits across the board. So when he was testing for the MCAS, he was only a few points shy. And from 3rd grade to 10th grade, he tested, we did all the boot camps, and he could never attain it. So his ETO came to me and said, well, what we can do is get a waiver from the state, and that way he doesn't have to go through anxiety. What they didn't tell me is that put him on a trajectory to graduation. And a lot of parents are told, well, they earned this graduation. It's a reward. What they don't tell you is once you physically take that diploma in your hand, your special education services stop. Whether that child is 18, 19, or whatever. Now, under IDEA, you are insured services until their 22nd birthday. So what happened is all along I'm being told, oh, well, Joshua's gonna have services and I'm going on college tours looking at their special needs services and supports. And, you know, he's gonna go to his prom. Yes, we want him to have a full inclusive experience. He's gonna go to his graduation. He's gonna be a walk only. Joshua went to his graduation and they all get the empty folders. And he went upstairs with the rest of the seniors and he came back with a diploma. I'm thinking, that's weird. Oh, it's gotta be a typo because you're a walk only. I'm going to Westville State in a few days to talk to the director about the ICE program. That's gotta be a typo. 3 days later, I get all of his records. He was graduated. His services were terminated. So, of course, I walk the fine line, not only as a parent, but culturally between being the irate mom or being an advocate. And what I did was I employed the services of my now business partner, an educational advocate, Kelly LaRoe, and she went in and she's like, this is against the law. Oh, no, he's graduated. You have his diploma, blah, blah, blah. Well, what they forgot was when Joshua got to 12th grade, he was 1 credit short. And he decided he wanted to take an extra school year as opposed to cramming that in on the weekend or at night. So we pulled up both of his senior IEPs, and the wording had been totally changed from educational supports to vocational supports. And they forged things and changed dates to support their graduation. So that was how we fought the Springfield school system to get him back on his IEP so that he could transition into the ICE program, which is Inclusive Concurrent Education under Westville State. But is my story typical? No. A lot of parents do not understand that once you take that diploma, that you are not protected by IDEA, and now your educational services end. And whether you're getting services under the Department of Developmental Services, they do not kick in until you're 22. He would have had 3-4 years of nothing. So it happens all the time. It's called push-up. Thank you. Thank you. I know, I can't, listen, this is a story that can go on and on, so I thank you so much for your time and thank you for your questions. And at any time you want to reach me, I am more than willing to come back, and I would love to bring Joshua back so everyone can meet him. He is going to be a change agent in Springfield. So to answer your question, that is where I see him. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you at our next Pride Talk. I have no idea what that date is.
March 26th, I think.
March 26th at noon. We're going to have, I believe, Elizabeth Morgan and Chris Hoppola as our speakers. So right here in this room?
Yes.
All right. So hopefully we'll see you back. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.